The chroniclers say the crown of Aragon was never gold, not truly, only ash hammered into a circlet and gilded for the sake of daylight. They say if you wore it long enough, a soot would cling to your hair, a penance that no washing could lift. In the winter of our Lord 1249, when the snow lay in ridges along the Pyrenean roads like folded altar cloths, King Aldphonse II stood bareheaded before the marble steps of Lacio in Zaragoza and prayed into stone. He was a pious man in the narrow and bruising way of piety, hard on himself, harder on anyone whose sin shadowed his own. The banner of his house, gules with 4 vertical pallets or hung without wind, the air was too cold to stir it. He had fasted 3 days. He had not slept. And in his palm he turned the iron ring of Saint Victorian, the coronation relic once stolen from a monastery and later redeemed with a shipload of wheat and 6 barrels of crimson dye. He prayed for the same thing men always pray for, absolution and a son who would not be a mistake. The bells called tears. The city answered in the creak of cartwheels and the hiss of breath through linen wraps. In the sacristy, Bishop Bernat of Huesca, whose hands shook only when they blessed, lifted a ledger bound in pigskin. Its clasp, a simple hook of brass, wore the scratches of 30 winters. Inside, names lay in neat columns like the bones of saints, births, deaths, tithes, unions, promises. King Aldphonse and Bishop Bernat had begun the ledger the year of the king's marriage, when the city still remembered the scent of rosemary fires and the French merchant who taught the cooks to glaze quail with honey. The bishop had written the oath himself. All secrets of the crown shall be entered here, that God may one day reconcile the house of Aragon with its own blood. But the first entry was not a secret at all, merely a date. The second, though, written in a gloom-black winter with ink that bit like iron, recorded a mistake. On the night of St. Blaise, the king lay with Lady Isolde de Alcazar while the queen bled again. A child was conceived. No names followed for months, only pen-scraped prayers. When the child finally came, he came in a wooden house beyond the walls, the midwife crossing herself by candlelight. Bernat wrote him in, and Aldphonse signed in the margin like a man copying his own sentence, G, and then a blot where his quill trembled, Schwellen. Aldphonse thought the ledger would save his soul. The bishop believed it would save the crown, because he had seen what secrets do to thrones. There are fires in pantries, sleeping among sacks of wheat. The queen, Olmodies of Béarn, had thin wrists and a jaw that never unclenched. Each loss hollowed her, and still she rose when bells called, and still she moved through the palace beneath banners of crimson and gold. She learned to braise lamb with juniper to keep the king at table. She learned to light a wax taper from a taper, so that flame passed gently from flame, and no one would risk breath and ash. Finally, she birthed a boy as pale as milk. They named him Raymond and swaddled him in a blanket stitched with tiny roses, the queen's prayer in silk. In the summer Raymond turned 5, the palace well gave a taste of tin. A mason whispered that the old lead was leaching. A physician whispered the word waning. The prince's joint seized, a bruise rose on his arm without touch. At harvest, his gums bled. The queen moved her son's bed to a south-facing window, sun like medicine on his face. The king, terrified into obedience, ordered new pipes made of stone. The bishop prayed until his knees blackened. The ledger slept, clasped and complete as a tomb. Do you believe God bargains with kings? The old men in the arcades insisted he does not. But kings, fearful animal that they are, make bargains anyway. Aldphonse made 2, one with God and one with the bishop. He swore to starve the kingdom of excess. He dismissed the mummers, unstrung the harps, sent falcons back to their mews unridden, if God would spare Ryman. And in the bishop's study he pressed a blank parchment under his ring and said, if he fails to thrive, if he is taken, what then? Bernat, who had grown old on caution, answered as if repeating a catechism, then the laws of succession speak. Your sister's boy in Jacques, the Count of Urgel's claim through your aunt, the queen's kin from Béarn if Rome will bless it. And none love Aragon, the king said, half a prayer, half a curse. He drew the iron ring down the parchment like a plowshare and whispered, there is another. The bishop closed his eyes. Majesty. No, Hanshi. Hear me. You have written him. Bernat's mouth tasted of tin. Those lines were inked for confession, not coronation. At Candlemas, a raven nested in the cathedral eaves. Each night it dropped black feathers like spent words. Bishop Bernat wrote a new entry with a hand that betrayed him. The king confers with me on the matter of issue. He names Guillaume and weeps. When he sealed the page, the wax took his ring's imprint with a sound like a low bell. Perhaps you imagine the boy in the forest, wild and sure-footed, a hunter's son who could read the bark of pines. You are almost right. Guillaume grew in a house of clean wooden boards 3 miles beyond the city, under the protection of a steward named Miquel, whose wife had never been blessed with children. Lady Isolde sent to a convent, cut her hair and learned to hear God's voice in the scrape of her broom. Guillaume played with village boys who did not know that his eyes were the king's eyes poured into a rougher mold. He learned to read in the bishop's kitchen, nicking his hand on the quill just once. He learned to bind a cut with spider silk and spit. He learned to walk behind a plow without pride. If guilt were a rope, King Aldefonse wore it under his shirt like a penitent's chain. He visited the boy twice, both times hidden in a hunting party. The first time, he spoke to him as one speaks to a stranger's child, gently wary of being cruel by accident. The second, he watched the boy fall and rise and fall again, and something in him unclenched. He is strong, he said to Miquel, voice scraped raw. He is stubborn, Miquel answered. He will survive teeth and winter both. Raimon grew and did not grow. His tutors praised his cleverness, and the queen clutched his hand with a hunger sharper than love. He learned Latin easily, and the litany of saints like birds on a line. When he tried to ride, the horse knew better and stood with the patience of a confessor. At 12, he swore the oaths of a prince, and wore a sword that hung absurdly low. Aragon sits like a knuckle pressed between France and the kingdoms of the peninsula. Its loyalty is a ladder that men climb and kick away. When the Count of Barcelona sent word offering a marriage between his granddaughter and Raimon, if the boy lived, if God allowed it, the king sent a purse of silver to sweeten the talk. When Navarre whispered of a pact, the queen pressed her crucifix to her lips and said, "We do not barter our child's blood for bread." The Pope's legate, a man with a nose like a dagger, wrote to Bishop Bernat to inquire about the firmness of the succession. Bernat's reply was a treatise of smoke, words that curled and vanished. Then the fire came. It started in the royal infirmary, where a tired nun fell asleep with the taper open to the air. The blaze ran along the rafters like a rat, found a store of oil and kissed it. At matins, the priests sang to a glow they thought was dawn. The Ashen crown was displayed in the treasury for the feast of St. Gregory. Half crown, half reliquary, silver under a fog of soot that no goldsmith had ever quite cleaned. The heat split its seam. When the flames slid lower into the chapel, the coronation ring cracked like ice, and a sliver of iron fell into the censer, hissing like a snake quenched in holy water. They doused the fire before it took the city, but the smell of burnt wax and prayer clung to everything for a week. You believe in signs? So did they. Whispers soldered themselves into certainty. God was displeased. With whom? The queen slept with her rosary in her fist. The king did not sleep at all. Bishop Bernat, shaking now not only when he blessed, opened the ledger and wrote, as if to trap the smoke inside the paper, "The crown is cracked. May God repair what men have broken." On a rain-bent evening, the steward Miquel was found with his skull split in the alley behind Saint Engracia. The purse on his belt lay open but not emptied. The knife that felled him had a hilt wrapped in yellow silk. "Catalan," the sheriff murmured, turning the blade under a clouded glass. "Or someone who wants us to think so." Miquel died, confessing only to his wife's cooking and his love of the boy, and nothing about who had visited their house at night in velvet. Who do you trust when the bell in your own tower sounds wrong? The queen's brother came from Bayarn with 20 men-at-arms and a gift of falcons that could see a hair in the thin light before dawn. He kissed the queen and looked too long at the prince, assessing him like a horse whose knees you test quietly. Raimon tried to stand straighter and coughed until a bit of blood bloomed at his lip. "We will find a physician from Montpellier," the brother said. "They cure what God does not." That night he walked with King Aldefonse along the loggia, the city spread like a prayer rug beneath them. "If the boy cannot hold a sword," he said too softly, "he must hold something else. A papal bull. An alliance sealed by a dowry hefty as a fortress. "He will hold his own blood in his body," the king said. "We are not vultures." "No," said the brother, smiling. "We are gardeners." The next day, the bishop's ledger disappeared. Bishop Bernat felt the absence like a pulled tooth. He upended the sacristy, his hands rummaging through cassocks and candles, prayer books and relic boxes. He accused no one, but suspicion watered its own vine. The queen's brother and his smooth, appraising eyes, the Count of Urgel's messenger who had come and gone with a hush about him, a novice with ink on his thumbs. Bernat aged 2 years in a day. When he collapsed into the chapter house, King Aldefons came with a face he used only for funerals. "Majesty," Bernat said, "I have sinned by keeping what I should have burned." The king knelt, a king kneeling to a priest, and pressed his forehead to the plank floor. "No, it was our soul." He did not say which soul. In the silence, they heard the raven in the eaves croak like a word half-remembered. The ledger is a ledger only while it lies closed. Opened, it is a mouth. In the hands of someone without fear, it was a trumpet. The first excerpts appeared nailed to the door of the Guildhall, pinned with a black ribbon like mourning for truth. The script was copied by a steady hand. The words were unadorned, and that made them obscene. On the night of St. Blaise, the king lay with Lady Isolde. Men read with their mouths open like children. Women read and press their lips together. The queen did not read at all. She burrowed into her bed like an animal who has learned that hiding cannot prevent the trap. A second sheet appeared, this one in the market where a butcher's blood pooled under his block. The boy was named Guillaume. And then, below in different ink, "Is he the one God preserved in the fire? Our relics cracked. Our bells are dumb. The Ashen crown demands a head that has tasted ashes." That line was not Bernat's. It was sharper, meant for the throat. "Would you have trusted your own blood with the crown?" The king rode in secret to the wooden house where Guillaume had lived. It was empty. The bench still wore the dent of a boy's weight. A sprig of rosemary lay on the table, forgotten or left as sign. The neighbor said, 2 men came with a cart at dawn. They said the steward's widow was to be cared for by the queen. The boy rode behind. He did not look back. In the palace, the queen called for ink and made a list of names. At the top, she wrote Bernat and then crossed it out, the only time in her life she took pity on a man's breath. She replaced it with Pere de Luna, a minor lord with a major appetite. She added Guillain, if he is not dead. The king took the list and burned it in a candle flame. "No," he said. "We will not become the story they want us to be. We will not drink their poison and ask for more." The court gathered for a feast meant to drown whispers in wine. The queen wore a gown woven with roses so faint you had to lean to see them. The prince sat at her right, a cup of watered wine he did not touch. The king forced laughter until his lips cracked. At a lower table, among men who would sell their mothers for the right purse, sat a youth with eyes that knew the rafters count, the distance to the door, the weight of a knife in his sleeve. He wore the clothes the queen's brother favored for his squires, yellow silk at the wrists, an insolent flash. He watched Raymond cough into his napkin and missed the bread trencher by an inch. The bishop blessed the bread. He lifted the cup, his hand steady for the first time in weeks. He drank. He set the cup down and sat before standing, a hesitation like a comma. Then he rose with an effort and said to no one at all, "Ah!" His eyes rolled back like shutters in wind. He fell so gently that for a heartbeat the room mistook it for a genuflection. Poison moves like a rumor, quickly, invisibly, and then suddenly you're dead. The court surged and stilled. The queen's scream was small and exact. The king knelt again on stone, a posture fate mocked in him. "Wine," someone shouted. "No," shouted someone wiser. The raven in the rafters dropped a feather. The youth with the yellow silk cuffs did not move. Bishop Bernat died with his mouth open, as if bitten by a word he meant to say. His fingers tightened around nothing and released it. On the table near him, a wax seal that had no right to be there rested in a plate of salt. "Who brought that?" the king asked, and no one answered. In the hours after, a thin rain began, a rain that made the palace stones sweat. Men ran messages across the city, rumors multiplied like loaves and miracle reversed. The legate's clerk appeared at the gate demanding to know whether the succession remained firm, and a guard laughed until he remembered himself. The queen's brother did not leave the prince's side. He fed him small pieces of pear with his own hand. He watched the door. The next morning, a packet arrived with the dawn, a folded parchment sealed in black. The wax bore the impression of the Ashen crown, though that seal lay in the treasury, cracked and cold. The messenger's livery was foreign, but his boots were local, scuffed with Zaragoza's dust. The king broke the seal with a knife. Inside, in a hand he recognized and did not, a letter said, "Majesty." The ledger was a mercy. You made it a weapon. Blood dishonored is blood endangered. The boy you called by a letter and a blot is not a rumor now. He is a man. He can ride. He can read. He knows the taste of ash. You will name him your heir before the feast of St. Michael, or I will nail the remaining pages to the gates of every church from Jaka to the sea, and let God read them aloud. The king passed the letter to the queen. She read it as if reading a menu, without curiosity, merely to know what must be endured. "Is it Bernat's hand?" she asked, because grief blurs edges. "No," the king said. "It is mine." For there, half hidden in a curl of flourish, was a way Aldefons made his SS's in youth, a sinuous line like a snake asleep. He had taught it to no one but his tutor's daughter and a boy in the bishop's kitchen who had laughed at the curve. The youth with the yellow silk cuffs arrived at vespers, escorted by 2 guards who had learned better than to underestimate anyone who moved that softly. He bowed before the throne, knees to the stone, head down. The king looked at the shape of him, the poverty of his boots, the careful hope he tried to crush, the jaw that did not unclench. The queen saw the eyes and made a sound as private as prayer. "What should I call you?" the king asked, the formality a bridge over a chasm. "Call me by what you wrote," the youth said, and his voice had the hoarseness of pine smoke. "Call me Guillaume. Do you know what is being said of you?" The queen's brother asked, light as a dancer. Guillaume did not turn to him. "Everyone knows what is said of bastards. You only choose which word to believe." "Brave," the brother said. "Or foolish." "Hungry," Guillaume said. They fed him at a small table with a clean cloth. He broke his bread like a man who had learned to share crumbs. The prince stared at him with a fierceness that, in a stronger body, might have ruled a realm. "Do you like falcons?" Raymond asked, childish and not. Guillaume considered. "I like what returns when you call it," he said. "Falcons do not." The king summoned the council. The queen lit a candle and another from it. The Ashen crown sat on the table between them, cracked at the seam but still cruelly beautiful. The iron ring, mended by a smith who crossed himself with every hammer fall, lay beside it. "We will not let a rumor choose our heir," the king said. "We will listen to God." A silence followed, into which every man poured the shape of his creed. A jurist cleared his throat to recite laws like beads. The legate's clerk spoke of Rome's interest in legitimate issue. The queen spoke only once. "My son has a soul." It was the only argument that could not be weighed against land. The king touched the iron ring as if to test whether it remembered his hand. "I will have no civil war," he said, an old man's vow, tender and impossible. "If the boy, if Raymond, if he cannot, we will make provision. We will name a regent. We will make a place for Guillaume." A guard burst the door without formality, which is how you know a kingdom is slipping. He held a ribbon, yellow, wet with rain, and something darker. "My lord," he said, and could not say more. They found the queen's brother at the base of the tower, neck broken like a snapped reed. On his wrist, the ribbon had been untied, or perhaps torn. There was no knife in him. The stones had done the work. A parchment was pinned to his doublet, lanced with a nail. The script was neat, almost fond. "Gardener, you will not prune this tree." At dawn, the bells did something they had not done since the fire. They sang. And oh, their song was not holy. It sounded like iron dragged across slate, like a ring forced onto a swollen finger, like a raven laughing. Men crossed themselves badly. Women pulled their children indoors. The market stayed closed. The prince asked for his tutor and declined to ride. The king asked for Guillaume and found he had no idea where to keep him. Too precious for the stables, too dangerous for the chapel. Tell me, do you believe loyalty survives a throne? Or is it an herb that grows only in the cracks of common life and shrivels when planted in a pot of gold? The king sat alone with the ashen crown and tried to imagine it on two heads. He tried to imagine God's face when he did whatever he was going to do next. In the outer courtyard, a hawk returned to the glove of a boy who had once gone by the name of no one at all. A feather drifted from the rafters. The ashen crown, cracked and patient as winter, watched the doors and waited for a head bold enough to carry its soot. Morning wore a thin crown of cloud, and the city kept its windows like eyelids half shut. The hawk that returned to Guillaume's glove shivered and bowed, and the boy stroked the feathers as if soothing some part of himself. Stable hands whispered and pretended not to. Word travels along walls faster than along roads. By the time the king crossed the courtyard, every mortar joint knew that a bastard had been summoned, a bishop had died, and a brother had fallen. Aldefons dismissed the pages and stood before the boy without witness. Up close, the resemblance was both sharper and less. The line of the nose the same, the brow not, the mouth the king's before years had trained it to lie. "Do you know falconry?" he asked, strangled by the smallness of the question. "I know hunger," Guillaume said, gentle, as if that were a shared craft. "And when a creature returns only because the sky has nothing better for it." The king nodded once. "You'll not hunt today." "No," said Guillaume. "Today I stay where I can be seen." In the palace chapel, candles were already pooling wax for Bishop Bernat. The queen knelt so long her veil stuck to the flagstones. When she rose, she left the print of her palms like a blessing she had not meant to give. Raimon, white as lit tallow, stood beside her with a steadiness that cost. He kept his eyes on the crucifix, because the floor swam, because the room had waves, because he could not find a flat sea anywhere in his body. "Mother," he whispered when no one could hear him, "am I a sin?" "No," she said, and pressed his fingers until they hurt. "You are a promise. Promises are not sins. They are debts." She did not say to whom. The legate came to the funeral in a cloak the color of old bone. His clerk, a waspish man whose throat worked when he swallowed other people's words, sniffed the incense as if it were evidence. After the psalm, after the bell, that Judas of iron, tolled and faltered on the 9th stroke, the legate bowed to the king and spoke with lips that did not part more than necessary. "The Holy Father is deeply grieved," he said. "He asks only that the realm be kept orderly and that the question of succession be closed with decorum and doctrine. Doctrine, you understand, is a city of walls built to keep certain men inside and certain truths out. Doctrine," the king said, "is clearer when God is not setting fire to our chapel." The legate's smile was a hinge. "God's fire purifies." "Does it purify letters?" the queen asked, arriving like a blade. "We received one under the crown seal we did not stamp. Perhaps Rome purifies that too." The legate's eyes flicked. He was not a stupid man. "Seals travel, Majesty, as do rumors." "So do niefs," murmured the king, and thought of a yellow ribbon. That evening, a council sat under tapestries that pictured older kings pretending at peace. The ashen crown lay on a tray of oak, cracked and smug. The iron ring rested beside it, mended but honest about the break. The jurist read from a parchment as if it were scripture. "By the laws of Aragon," he said, "legitimate issue proceeds. Failing that issue, the crown passes to the nearest male of the royal blood who is not disbarred by oath or crime." "Who is not disbarred by birth?" asked the queen. The jurist dipped his head. "Bastardy is a word," the king finished. "Our blood is not a word. It runs." He could hear his own desperation, the thinness of it. The legate's clerk unfolded a vellum crisp as frost. "Rome," he announced with more relish than piety, "has powers to legitimate certain births by grace, when good for realm and church. A petition accompanied by appropriate alms, the price?" the queen asked, not blinking. The clerk named it without shame. A castle near the border for the knights, 2.5 chests of coin, a promise to prosecute certain heresies in the foothills. The queen turned her head so that her veil moved like the shadow of a wave. "So, she said. Our son cost less than a fortress, but more than a prayer. Your son, the legate said carefully, cost what peace must cost. Guillaume was invited into the council chamber not to speak, but to be studied. He wore plain wool, and his steward's widow had pressed the sleeves with an iron hot from the hearth. He took off his cap and held it like a man carrying his house. He looked at the table, the ring, the crown, the men. He did not look at the queen. He could not. He could feel her gaze like a brand. Boy, said the jurist, who labored under the error that law is made stronger by contempt, did anyone place a cup in the bishop's hand? Guillaume's mouth twitched. His hand placed the cup in mine when I learned letters in his kitchen. But that was years ago. Not what I asked. Then ask me what you mean, the boy said. And the king felt a small perverse joy that did not belong to a father, only to a man who loves a blade well forged. No cup squire confessed, no cook ran, no poison could be named. A little white powder would have done it, a bitter almond on a holy tongue. The queen's brother had whispered with 2 knights from the Count of Barcelona's house the night before he fell. One was gone from the city by morning. The guard who brought the yellow ribbon had torn it from the stair in panic, too late to see whose foot had slipped and whose hand had pushed. Evidence is always the tidiest servant of the last man to touch it. Wall the tower stairs with iron, the king ordered, and strike the bells at dawn and dusk only, let them remember discipline. He wanted to forbid writing, and then saw the folly of it. Men will write with ash if you take away their ink. Would you have seen the next betrayal coming? Or would you have loved your certainty until it killed you? At Compline a letter came into the queen's hands under a napkin on a silver tray, a maid's hand, a laundress's face. The wax seal bore a rose crushed beyond recognition. Inside, the hand small, precise, looped, unlike men's. Majesty, it said, you do not know which blood runs truest. Raimon is yours. He was born, he breathed, he was placed in your arms. But the midwife, Agna of the wooden bridge, held 2 infants that night. One cried like a blade on glass. The other made almost no sound, a lamb. One had a star on his shoulder. Ask your God why he gives signs to the poor. The ledger knows. The ledger writes what I saw. It was not signed. The queen folded it along the crease of her control and slid it into her sleeve. She found Agna not in the city but 2 fields beyond, where the river goes slow and stomachs go faster. The old woman's hands were cracked maps. She had bound and unbound more hopes than any priest. My lady, she said without ceremony, because she had bled with queens and with seamstresses and learned the equality of agony. You're late to ask. Was there? The queen swallowed the word and chose another that could bear a crown. Another? Agna lifted a pot lid and let out steam that smelled like bones and thyme. There is always another. A twin sometimes hides beneath, a twin like a coin under bread. But that night, no twin of yours. You bled, and God kept you from dying because he wanted more punishment from you here. The other woman, Isolde, birthed and bit her hand and birthed again, but that was 2 winters before. I signed my name in the bishop's book when you asked me. I do not sign twice for the same night. Then who wrote to me? A woman who wants a fire, Agna said. Or a man who writes like one. Stars on shoulders fade. The only true signs are bellies and graves. The queen walked back under a sky the color of dull knives. On the bridge, a cut rope hung like a question. She put her hand on the stone and spoke to it. I am tired of your lessons, she told God. Teach my enemies something for a change. In the weeks that followed, Aragon discovered how many corners a shadow can find. Men met in the guild hall and spoke of the boy Guillaume as if he were a storm, coming. Perhaps, but perhaps not. Batten your shutters, save your grain, wait. Women met at fountains and measured for coffins. They are always accounting for death in advance. Raimon's cough eased and then worsened, like the tide pretending not to return. He sat with Guillaume once in a window niche that made them seem like a diptych in a chapel no longer funded. My tutor says, Raimon began and faltered. What does he say? That I must copy the Psalms until I understand them. Raimon looked at his ink-stained thumb as if it held a prophecy. Do you understand them? I understand this, Guillaume said. David kept sheep before he kept a throne. He killed a giant with a stone. But afterward he killed a man because he wanted a woman. He repented. His songs helped his sin wear nicer clothes. Men fashion their guilt into music when the noose would be simpler. Raimon smiled with the special courage of the sick. You are unkind. I am hungry, Guillaume repeated. Hunger is unkind. Do you want the crown? Raimon asked with the bluntness of a prince who had never been allowed to want anything simpler than salvation. I want the door unlocked, Guillaume said. Whichever door I am behind. They were found there by a lady-in-waiting with hair the color of spilled wine. She curtsied to Raymond because that was choreography. She looked once only, at Guillaume as if at a hawk on a glove. Admiration and warning married in one gaze. Her name was Isabelle de Cervoles. She had the misfortune to be clever and the skill to hide it except from those with the same misfortune. Later, in a hall ajar with moonlight, she passed Guillaume a slip of vellum that did not touch his palm long enough to count. Do not read it, she said without moving her lips. Burn it, but obey. Then she was gone, and her absence smelled faintly of violet and ash. In the grate behind the stables, Guillaume burned the vellum and read anyway by the light of its refusal. The letters broke like cinders. The legatus clerk meets with Pere de Luna at midnight near the chapter house. The word dispensation lies between them like a dagger. If you want a crown, you will steal the dagger and leave them with their fingers. If you want a life, you will go to the convent of Saint Oliva and ask for Sister Isolde before dawn. He chose. Would you have chosen differently? Midnight holds sounds in its mouth. Guillaume moved through them as he had learned in a forest. Step when the wind goes, pause when it stills, trust your head, betray your heart only when necessary. At the chapter house door he heard the clerk's reed thin voice and Pere de Luna's heavy chuckle. The word dispensation did lie between them, on parchment, beside a little silver weight. If Rome blesses the bastard, mused Pere, we will saddle him so hard he will be grateful to carry us. The clerk clicked his tongue. If Rome blesses any of you, it will be because we find the alms large enough to make God look elsewhere for his saints. Guillaume watched the flame's reflection in the clerk's eyes and stepped into it. Some doors open because you knock, others because you do not give them the choice. He did not draw a blade. He drew a truth. If Rome blesses me, he said softly, it will be because I was in reach when all your plans were not. Pere de Luna's hand went to his belt and found Guillaume's fist there first. The clerk squeaked. The parchment slid into the boy's sleeve like a trained snake. Guillaume would have fled if not for the way Pere smiled. It was not fear. It was adoption. You are quicker than your father, Pere said, or less burdened by prayer. My father hesitates, Guillaume said, as if naming a saint. I cannot afford it. Blessed are the poor, the clerk whispered, and then bit his tongue because he had meant to mock. In the boy's face he saw something that made mockery feel like blasphemy. At the convent, dawn came like a confession, late, ashamed, necessary. Guillaume knocked with his knuckles because the door was old enough to bruise easily. A lay sister opened and looked past him for the armed men who usually came with boys at that hour. Sister Isolde, he said, and the woman's face closed and opened again as a shutter does in rain. She is in the laundry, the sister said, where women wash what others have stained. Sister Isolde had cut her hair so close that penitents had no more room. Her hands smelled of lye and rosemary. She looked at Guillaume and saw the king's mouth and the boy's hunger and her own mistake braided in one rope. She handed him a rag to hold because there are conversations the hands must be busy for. I did not ask you to come, she said, but I wished it. Someone wished louder, he replied. Who? Isabel, Isolde said, and for a moment the convent fell away and she was again a girl at the bishop's kitchen, hair free down her back, laughing with a lady-in-waiting who knew how to fold a message into a dance. She believes gardens can be redeemed, even when the gardeners have been thrown from towers. You wrote the letter to the queen. It was not quite a question. No, Isolde answered, and the truth in it struck like a slap. I wrote to no one. I have written to God until my ink dried, and he did not reply. The queen came to me once and left with nothing. That is the only mercy I have left to give. Guillaume looked at her and saw not a mother but a mirror. "Do you want me to be king?" "I want you to live," she said. "Kings do not. They only delay dying long enough to ruin others." She took his face in her lie-stung hands and kissed his brow as if wiping a stain. "Go," she said, "before my courage fails." In the palace, the dispensation, half signed, awaiting the legate's flourish, appeared on the king's table wrapped in a cloth. No note. Only the smell of laundries and violets. The king touched the parchment and felt the give of calfskin, the way it takes ink as if taking blame. The legate, summoned, composed his face. "If this has been stolen," he said, "the sin of theft does not cancel its grace. It merely reduces the price," the queen said dryly, and he almost smiled because honesty is a surprise. The council chambers filled with men who smelled of damp wool and calculation. The jurist held the dispensation like a relic and read, lips moving. Rome would recognize Guillaume as fit to inherit, in case of necessity in exchange for the gifts named. The language was a hedgehog. You could touch it, but it would prick you. The queen closed her eyes and saw her son's face, and then the boy's. She opened them and saw only a crown, cracked where fire had taught it humility too late. "Name them both," said Pere de Luna, who had once loved risk and now loved certainty. "Name Raymond king and Guillaume prince of Barcelona. Give Raymond a wife whose blood is iron, and give Guillaume a wife whose dowry is an army. If one fails, the other stands, like twin buttresses under a roof no mason trusts." "Whose daughters?" the king asked, exhausted enough to consider scents that wore the clothes of betrayal. "Navarre will pay to keep France from our bed," Paris said. "And Provence owes me a favor written in a ledger only I can read." He did not look at the queen when he said ledger. He did not have to. The legate pressed his advantage like a coin into a palm. "Rome will bless a double wedding," he said, "and send a cardinal to crown the boy who lives longer." There it was, said plainly enough that men flinched. He did not mean cruelty. He meant policy. Would you have allowed it? Married a breath to a sword? The king nodded once, the nod of a man who had cut wood in winter and known there was no other way to keep the house warm. "Send for Navarre," he said. "Send for Provence. Send for—" He stopped because he felt something shift in the floor. Not the floor. The room. The air tilted. Isabel de Cervole stood at the threshold with an expression she had saved for the last resort. She held a candle, daylight be damned, and its flame unsteady as a truth spoken too late. "Majesty," she said to the queen first, and for that the queen would love and distrust her ever after. "You must hear me before you bind us all to bells that will not ring." "Speak," the queen allowed, because she recognized courage when it bled on her carpet. "Pere de Luna murdered your brother," Isabel said, soft as a prayer in a sick room. "Not with his hands, those are too valuable, but with a purse that changed hands on the lodger's stair. The man who pushed him wore your livery, Pere. The ribbon was yours. The message nailed to his chest was written by a scribe in your house. I know his ellipses. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of fear." Pere de Luna did not blanch. He smiled the way a river smiles when it finds a steeper bed. "Lady," he said, "you do me too much honor. If I had intended to prune, I would have pruned cleaner." The king's hand went to the iron ring as if it were a sword hilt. "Is it true?" Pere did not lie. Men like him do not believe in it. "It is useful," he said, and it was done. "Your brother was a gardener who thought all trees were his to shape. I prefer wild oaks to men with shears." The queen moved before anyone expected. She slapped him. The sound in that chamber was the purest thing that had happened there in months. Pere took it without flinching because to flinch would be to admit he had miscounted the candles in this church. "You will leave," the king said, and heard how small a sentence banishment is when a man has friends in every shadow. "Now?" Pere bowed, as if to a card table he had cleared. "Majesty." To Guillaume he said, in passing, "When they have finished using you as a saint, come find me. I am better company for sinners." Then he was gone, and the door learned to breathe again. In the sudden space he left, decisions rushed in like birds let out of a net. The double marriage was proclaimed. The city forced to taste joy with knives in its throat. Navarre sent a princess with eyes like winter fields and a dowry of horsemen who had learned to sleep in the saddle. Provence promised a girl whose laugh had been weighed against ports and found heavier. Raymond was given the Navarrese bride, Guillaume, Provence, the match less about tenderness than about ropes tied across rivers. The procession for the betrothals wound through Zaragoza like a vein, the people dressed in fear as finery. Flowers fell from windows like surrendered flags. The ashen crown did not grace the boys' heads, that would wait. But the iron ring was brought on a cushion to be touched, as if touching could be counted as time already served. The bells, obedient for once, rang like men trying to remember a song they had loved before it was outlawed. That evening they feasted because men must, even when famine of truth is on the table. Raymond drank a little sweet wine and lived. Guillaume drank water and tasted ash. The Navarrese princess, Inez, looked at Raymond and saw a boy brave enough to sit upright under a mountain. The Provençal, Claire, looked at Guillaume and saw a hawk with the sky still in his eyes. They exchanged vows of the thinner sort, meant to fatten later. The queen smiled for the tapestries and cried in the linen. After midnight, Isabel found Guillaume with a palace stone still remembered son. She put a finger to her lips and led him down to the old bath where mosaics had been laid in a century when men believed paradise could be made of tiles. "Your mother is safe," she said. "For now. I have paid the convent's debts for 2 years. After that, consecrate her or marry her to a farmer far from the taste of rumor." "Why help me?" he asked, because he had decided that every kindness in court carried a hook. "Because I prefer oaks to men with shears," she said, and smiled flicker fast. "And because when I was a girl, the bishop let me read the ledger while I pretended to replace his quills. I know all your fathers. I know all your sins. I am tired of men who keep books to punish themselves and then use them to punish others." She touched his sleeve. "If I say fly, fly. But not yet. Not until the ring is on one finger and cannot be pried off without breaking bone." "Which finger?" he asked. "The one that bleeds," she said, and left him to his own echoes. 2 nights later, the bells rang wrong again. This time it was not omen but alarm. A fire ran along the chancery shelves like a wolf. The documents of 2 generations roared their secrets, and then did not. In the yard, a raven lifted with a bit of charred vellum in its beak, as if stealing language from men. The blaze should have burned the dispensation to mercy, but the king had taken it to sleep under his pillow like a childhood relic. He woke coughing and clutching it, ink smudged to a bruise on his cheek. By morning, Zaragoza smelled once more of wax and prayer cooked too long. The people, hungry for a villain that wasn't the plague of chance, latched onto one like starving dogs to bone. "The bastard!" someone shouted, and then enough someones made a crowd. Guillaume would have been torn if not for Raymond, who walked out into sunlight with the unsteady dignity of a martyr not yet chosen, and lifted his small hand. "My brother," he said in a voice that did not reach the back row but reached the front where it needed to. "My brother stands because I ask him to. If you pull him down, I will fall with him, and your bread will be ash for a generation." It was a prince's first true act. The crowd, which had seen saints and hung thieves, paused at the novelty of honest courage. Someone tossed a rose. It landed at Raymond's feet and looked like a bloodstain pretending to be a gift. "Would you have trusted the boy then? Would you have named him before Saint Michael?" The feast approached like a deadline chiseled into a tomb. The king made his last fast of the season and found that hunger, when you choose it, is sweeter than when it chooses you. He wrote a proclamation with his own hand. "We will crown Raymond," it said, "and name Guillaume heir of Barcelona and defender of Aragon. Any man who rises against one, rises against both." He sealed it, and the wax took the ashen crown's bite cleanly for the first time since the fire. At Vespers on the eve of St. Michael, with the city holding its breath between fear and relief, the legate came to the king with a face like a house where a window has been broken. "Majesty," he said, "Rome has relented. The dispensation is whole. But a courier from Bordeaux brings this." He held out a parchment that smelled of sea salt and apple rot. The seal on it bore a lion. The letter inside was written with the confidence of a man whose hand had built ships. To the King of Aragon it said, "I write to remind you that a wedding once promised is a debt unpaid. My nephews hold claims through your aunt. If you crown a boy who cannot ride and prepare to set a bastard beside him, my sails will blot your eastern light. Choose wisely. Winter is long, and men prefer to pillage in warm weather." The king passed the letter to the queen. She read and folded it slowly, then lifted her eyes to her husband, to Raymond, to Guillaume, to the iron ring waiting like a test, to the ashen crown that wanted any head foolish enough to hope. "We will choose," she said, "and we will bleed for it." "Then let it be ours," the king replied, and stood. Outside, the raven on the eaves shook rain from its feathers and laughed, a sound like a seal broken in the dark. Inside, the candles trembled. The doors to the chapel swung open on their old hinges. The iron ring lay ready, the crown listening. The priest lifted his hands. The people leaned forward as if to catch a falling fruit. "Tell me, do you believe a kingdom can be saved by the truth spoken at the right breath? Or are we all merely birds circling a field already reaped, searching the stubble for a forgotten grain?" The bell drew breath to sing. The king drew breath to speak. Two boys stood at the edge of a winter their fathers had sworn to forbid. And then, as if the city herself had decided to interrupt history, the wind blew through the nave, carrying with it a shower of black feathers from the eaves, and the candle flames bent as one, and the iron ring on the cushion rolled an inch of its own accord and came to rest pointing, like a compass, directly, unforgivingly, at one of them. The cushion trembled. The iron ring shivered once more, then lay still, its split seam like a healed wound pointing, without apology, to the boy who had learned hunger first. "Guillaume!" A breath broke through the crowd as if the city had been held underwater and allowed one gasp. Someone crossed himself with a hand that shook. Someone else whispered, "No," and meant God, and meant fate, and meant the king. Aldefonse did not move. The ashen crown on the oak tray looked almost amused, soot smile thin as a cut. The queen's fingers found the edge of the table and held, as if a wave had taken the floor. The legate glanced at the ceiling, perhaps to see if God would blink. It was Raymond who stepped forward. Unsteady, yes, bones light as birds' bones, but with that strange grace of those near the brink, a grace that spends itself without counting. He stood between the ring and the boy at whom it pointed, and he looked back, not at his father, not at the priest, but at the mother whose jaw had held a kingdom together. "If I wear it," he said simply, "the bell will toll for me before Candlemas." Silence accepted the truth it could not bear to speak. Raymond lifted the ring. It was heavier than an iron circle ought to be, as if every oath ever sworn had settled in it like silt. He turned to Guillaume. Those two faces, alike and not, met like mirrors tilted to catch the same thin light. "Brother," Raymond said, tasting the word for the first time in public. "You asked once if falcons return. I do not, but I can send something back." He slid the ring toward Guillaume's hand. The boy hesitated. Behind him, the raven in the eaves made a sound like laughter being strangled for its own good. The queen's breath became a prayer with no words in it. The king reached out as if to stop a horse already falling. "Stop," Aldefonse said, the plea of a man who has learned too late that every choice is a kind of murder. Raymond did not stop. He took Guillaume's hand, palm up, lines like rivers he would never read. He pressed the ring onto the middle finger, the one Isabel had named, and the iron met flesh and bit. A bead of blood rose quickly, as if glad to be summoned at last. The iron cooled to the skin and would not be coaxed back. The priest flinched. The legate closed his eyes and forgot to open them. The bell in the tower drew breath, and this time when it sang it rang clean, no Judas in it. The sound leapt from stone to bone and ran down the streets. Men in the market looked up from their scales. A cobbler straightened and wiped his hands. A child stopped mid-cry and listened. The ashen crown allowed itself to be lifted. The king's hands were steady because the only way forward was through. He did not place it on his own head, nor on the son who bore his legal name, but on the son who bore his mouth and his stubbornness and the ledger's sin. The soot kissed Guillaume's hair and stayed. For a heartbeat, the crown seemed too large, then not large enough, then perfectly wrong in the way a destiny is. "Guillaume," Aldefonse said, and each letter was a penance. "By the grace of God and the hunger of Aragon, you are crowned." The people did not cheer. They bowed. It is a more serious thing. Raimund stood very still, like a candle practicing the art of not going out in a draft. Inez of Navarre moved a step toward him and stopped, because every woman knows when the moment belongs to a man and his breath. He turned to her and gave her a small, honest smile that she would remember on winter nights to heat her hands. "You will have a husband still," he whispered. "Only not a king. Forgive me." "I would rather keep a man than bury a crown," she answered, and surprised herself with the truth. Pere de Luna, banished but not far, heard the bells from a courtyard he should not have been near and laughed, but softly. "Very well," he told the heir. "The boy wears ash. Let us see if he can wear fire." The legate found his voice like a man finds his hat after a storm, grateful, a little abashed. He intoned the blessing Rome reserved for kings who began badly and might yet end worse. The priest said the right words, which is all any priest can do. The queen stepped forward and touched Guillaume's cheek with 2 fingers. They came away smudged dark. She did not wipe them on her gown. She bore them like a heraldry too intimate for banners. "Would you have me call you son?" she asked, and there was no softness in the question, only fairness. "No," he said, because he would not rob her of the shape of love she had made from pain. "Call me what I am." He did not add king. He did not need to. Raimund's legs failed him then, not with drama but with the practical economy of a body that had spent its coin. Guillaume caught him before the stone could, and for a moment the new king's arms were full of the crown he could not keep, and the brother he could not save, and the people he had just been given. He lowered Raymond gently, as if into a bed he would be allowed, this once, to rise from. Aldefonse looked older than he had that morning. "The ledger," he said to no one specific and everyone at once. "Bring me the bishop's ledger." Isabel appeared from the side with a bundle wrapped in linen, as if she had guessed long before the rest. She placed it in his hands, that pigskin book with its brass hook that had trapped so many winters. The king took it as one takes a blade. He carried it to the foot of the altar. "You wanted it to save our souls," he said to Bernat Stone, to God, to the raven. It did what all good intentions do when set near a throne. He laid it open to the page where ink once bit like iron, where the blot on the G dried into fate. He touched the line with a tenderness that did not excuse anything. Then he pulled the candle nearer, and the flame bent like a courtier and set the page alight. Fire reads faster than men. It took the ledger's confessions and translated them into smoke, into a language only heaven can parse. The people watched without understanding and understood without knowing how. The queen watched and said nothing, because sometimes the holiest thing is to let a man undo his own knots. Outside, the raven circled once, twice, as if counting. It caught a small blackening scrap in its beak, a curl of the letter G, and carried it into the light. No omen could have been clearer, and yet men would argue it for years in taverns that smelled of sour wine and chosen loyalties. The double wedding was not annulled. Inez and Raimond were married under a canopy that the wind loved too much. Claire of Provence placed her palm in Guillaume's and felt the grit the soot had left there. "We are not saints," she murmured. "Good," he said. "Saints make poor allies." Winter came as it always does, not when the calendar declares it, but when a first hard frost turns the well-rope to glass and the kitchen breath to scripture. Bordeaux sent another letter and received no answer that would fold. Navarre kept its bargain. The legate returned to his Rome with more alms than shame. Pere de Luna went to ground the way a root does, invisibly, purposefully, already thinking of spring. Raimund did not die that year. He did not live easily either. He learned the peace that is made of small obediences, opening his hand when it closed, eating when he could not taste, laughing for Inez in rooms where their bodies made a little summer. He rode once, badly, and fell, and did not try again, and forgave himself with effort. From his window he watched his brother govern as if he were mending something that could actually be mended. A wall, a bridge, a sentence. Guillaume learned quickly the weight of a seal on wax, of a signature that can send men to graves or to suns. He rode to the borders the lion had threatened, and did not blink when ships like teeth took the horizon. He negotiated with swords and with bread, and preferred bread until he could not. He kept the iron ring in its bite, and did not try to prise it off, not even when the flesh beneath it ached. When he slept, he dreamed of ledgers burning cleanly and of bells that do not lie. Aldefonse, who who had once tried to master God by writing him down, began to pray without ink. He walked in the cloister and taught himself to listen to silence until it said something different each day. On a cold morning, he found a raven feather on the step. He tucked it into his psalter. He did not tell anyone. The ashen crown did not become less itself. It stained every head that stooped to it. But from that day it learned to stay on only one at a time. That is no small mercy. You came for a curse, I know. For poison in a chalice and a dagger behind a tapestry. You have had those. But the greater curse is this: when men choose rightly, it does not undo what came before. It only makes a narrower road through it. A kingdom is saved not by saints but by those who bleed where the ring decides. The ledger burns, the bell rings true once, the raven laughs, and still tomorrow asks for bread, for treaties, for a hand to hold an heir when his breath comes hard. Would you have done it? Would you have set the crown on the head that the iron chose and lived with the stain? Or would you have told the bell to hush and kept the ring for love? Tell me, what would you have done in his place? Leave your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this tale, listen next to the queen who burned her own dynasty, or the last heir of the Iron Throne.